Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. It's so good to be here with you today. I thought in today's show I might explore a few thoughts that I've wrestled with recently about discovering God in a fresh and ever more realistic fashion. A discovery not based on my expectations of how God might act, but on my reception to a God of unexpected relationships. Now, I am tempted in this, what we call solosode, to dive deep into theology. But I've decided instead of diving deep into theology, is to dive deep into a story. And that's what I want to talk about. So today, I want to begin with, it's a nearly 3,000-year-old story of the prophet Elijah and his contest with the priests of the Baals, his journey of 40 days and concluding with an encounter with God on Mount Sinai. So, Paul, tell me, you always tell me to tell more stories on the show. Yeah. Do you think the story of Elijah is what you had in mind?
I'm not sure, but I'm going to listen.
That's what I'm hoping most of our listeners will say. I'm not sure, but I'm going to listen. I'm going to give him like 10 minutes and see what he has to say. So here we go. The story of Elijah has been this one story that's found for those of you who are interested in text. It's found in the book of Kings, the first book of Kings, chapters 18 and 19. And it's a magnificent story. Elijah, the renowned prophet Elijah, he's the probably most famous prophet. He and Moses are considered the major prophets of the Old Testament in the Jewish tradition. And Elijah is facing an issue with people worshiping what the god called Baal. And so Elijah comes up with a challenge to the prophets and priests of Baal and says, let's do this. You take a bull, cut the bull into pieces, put on your altar a stack of wood, and I will do the same thing. And I will cut up a bull, create an altar, put a stack of wood, and put the bull on the altar. And then we will pray to our gods to light the fire. We will not do it physically ourselves. Our God must light the fire. And so Elijah said, in all fairness, let's have you go first. So the priests of the Baal was very excited to do this. And they had the altar, put the wood on the altar, put the pieces of the bull on the altar, and then did their praying and their chanting and singing to Baal to light the fire, and he didn't light the fire. And Elijah went through the morning, and he said, looks like maybe you need a little more time. What if you prayed differently? And so they just started jumping and dancing around. They were actually cutting themselves and blood going everywhere, doing whatever they could do to get their God to light the fire, and their God didn't light the fire. So Elijah says, okay, my turn. And it was drawing near evening. And Elijah said, let's make this a little bit more interesting. So he had the altar, had the wood, had the pieces of the bull on the wood. And then he tells his people, bring 4 large buckets of water. And let's pour those over the wood, so we make it a little bit more difficult to light the fire. Elijah repeated that 2 more times, 3 times, 12 buckets of water. And then Elijah prayed to the God Almighty, the one and true God, to light this fire. And the fire was lit and bursted into flames immediately. And everybody turned to realize that Yahweh was the one and true God. And like all great Old Testament stories, there's got to be a little blood and violence. And so Elijah then, had them shepherd off all these prophets, and he went somehow by himself. I don't know who was with him, but he killed them all. So Elijah has this image of God, the powerful God, that shows himself in magnificent, if not miraculous, ways. And Ahab, the king, was there at the same time, and the king runs off and tells his wife Jezebel, who is a God-hater, and sends word to Elijah, "May the gods do to me what you did to the prophets if you are not dead by this evening." So Elijah panics. Now, I don't get why he panics. He just saw God light this fire, that God could take care of him, but he doesn't feel that way, so he runs. And he runs all day long, and he's just flat, weary, and tired, goes to sleep underneath a tree. And angels come, because he has not eaten, and minister to him and give him bread and water. And he goes back to sleep after eating that. And then the angels come once again, and the angels said, "You need to eat, Elijah, because you are going on a journey. You're going on a trek through the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting, without food or water." I'm sure he had some water, but without food, and you will go on this long journey, and then you will have an experience that will impact you for your life. Elijah takes off on the journey. There's not much written in the text about what went on in the journey, but I'm very familiar with biblical journeys of 40 days. We have one of Jesus going through the wilderness for 40 days where he was tempted and came into reckoning with his role as Messiah. We have one of Moses, that Moses had 40 days on Mount Sinai, the same mountain that Elijah is heading for, on Mount Sinai, and he had 40 days of fasting before he was given the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. And this 40 days represents a time of experiencing God. And in today's desert teachers, that time, those 40 days, are typically a time especially for the likes of Elijah and Moses, a time to prepare Elijah for a whole new teaching about a different understanding of God. And this is by what is called, what the desert teachers today call, purgation and purification. And purgation is the removal of preconceptions of what it means to be who God is and who we are in the presence of God. So we are removing all of our distractions, removing our preconceptions. It is a chance where Elijah had this opportunity to remove these things that were getting in the way of who God really is. Now, you have to keep in mind that Elijah has seen God do miracles throughout his ministry. And so he is used to the fire lighting God. That's why he prayed with such confidence that the one and true living God would light that fire. So this was the God that Elijah was used to. But I think God, as we will find out in the conclusion of the story on Mount Sinai, that God had something very different in mind, had a very different idea of his nature that he wanted to give to Elijah. And that reminds me of yet another story. So let me go into a story within a story. And that is a story that is told of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And John the Baptist is in jail. Now remember, John the Baptist baptized Jesus, said this is the one who is expected, who is coming. He is the coming of the Messiah. And John had high expectations of Jesus. And as John from jail heard word of the way that Jesus was performing, the way Jesus was acting, it was not in accordance with what John expected. John expected more of that messianic, getting rid of the Romans and reinstalling Israel as the kingdom of the world. So John, concerned about the acts of Jesus, sent his disciples to Jesus. And basically, John asked them to ask Jesus, Are you the expected one, or should we expect another? Are you the expected one, or should we expect another? And Jesus' response, I wrote this down because I thought this was very cool. Jesus' response to John's disciples was, "Go tell John what you hear and see. The blind can see, the cripple can walk, the deaf can hear, the dead are raised from the dead, and the good news is preached to the poor." What does this have to do with the king coming and taking rulership over the Romans? Nothing. But this was the ministry of Jesus, to heal the blind, the cripple, the deaf, and to preach the gospel, the good news to the world. So Jesus' answer to John was basically, and this is important, and this goes back to Elijah, that Jesus' answer to John was, yes, I am the expected one. I just did not come in the expected way. I'm the expected one. I just did not come in the expected way. And you know what's really interesting is the last words of Jesus in this little story. He says, it is written in most texts, blessed are those who do not stumble because of me. And, you know, that's interesting and that's good. How are you going to stumble over, you know, a kind, wonderful man? But if you were looking for a king, a ruler, a warrior, and instead you get a humble lover, you are not ready for this. And so what's really interesting in the Greek text, the word stumble is really, the Greek word is scandalizomai. And so I take it as a cognate to mean Jesus tells John's people, blessed are those who are not scandalized by me. Blessed are those who are not scandalized because I do not live up to their expectations. I live according to my expectations. And so that takes us back to Elijah as he's in the wilderness and he is purgating, he's removing his expectations of God, because it seems when he does the encounter with God, he is totally prepared for what God presents. So he goes, he does his 40-day journey, he climbs a mountain, and he rests for one day in a cave. And then he is awakened by what is said in the text, a great wind. Now, it is said this wind blew the rocks off the mountains and split mountains. So we are looking at like gale force hurricane winds. This is not like a 60-mile-an-hour wind. This is a very powerful wind. And that would be the kind of thing you would think Elijah would say, God is here. That is where God is. But the text is very clear. After the wind, and Elijah realized God is not in the wind. And then there was an earthquake, same sorts of tumult. And then there was a fire with additional tumult. And each time it said, God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. And then Elijah, still waiting, is beckoned with a quiet, peaceful, gentle breeze. And God was in the gentle and quiet breeze. And Elijah says, here I am, Lord. Basically, what will you have me do? And I think that lesson really hits us personally, hits me very deeply personally. We live in a world of tumult, terrible, terrible, terrible. We have wars, we have climate that could destroy the earth, we have impossible world-destructive weaponry and nuclear weapons. We live in a place where the world could easily end, and we're expecting, where is God? I can't tell you where is God, except that God is here. And God is here not as we expect him, but as God is prepared to reveal himself. So I believe this journey of Elijah prepared this already proficient prophet for a whole new understanding of the nature of God. And is that not what all of us are looking for today? God or the holy or the divine, whatever language you want to use, but presented to us in a language that is both fresh and real. And when it does come, it most often comes in ways that we do not expect. And as they say in Hebrew closings, Selah. Thank you for listening and tuning in for the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, as always, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.